Scientists have a lot of answers to the world's most difficult-to-solve problems, but they don't have all the answers. That doesn't just go for the problems that face the world today, but also some of the most puzzling discoveries of the past. Archaeologists often turn to scientists for help when they can't explain the things they find, but there are times when scientists can't help them. Everything you're about to see in this video is an archaeological mystery that science struggles to get to the bottom of. In 1891, American geologist Dr. E.H. Barber was summoned to investigate a series of strange, spiral-shaped rock structures in Nebraska, USA. He spent years studying them, but couldn't fully explain them, and we're still struggling to do so today. The bizarre shapes are full of sand, and the white material that makes up their wall is unidentified. To give things a sinister twist, Barber found dead rodents at the bottom of almost every single one of them. He gave them the name demonoliks, based on a nickname that had already been given to them by local ranchers, devil's corkscrews. The current working theory is that these shapes were made by creatures known as palaeocasters, a species that became extinct 20 million years ago, but is thought to have been similar to the modern-day beaver. The creature might have dug out the spirals as a type of burrow, filled them with sand to stay warm, and took rodents in there with them to eat. That sounds pretty far-fetched, but it's the best idea we have at the moment. We tend to believe that the science of developing prosthetic limbs is a relatively recent one, but history shows us that isn't correct. Here we see a prosthetic wooden toe affixed to the foot of an Egyptian mummy. The individual wearing the toe passed away 3,000 years ago. Experts have studied the toe extensively and reached the conclusion that it was amended and refitted several times, presumably in an attempt to make it more comfortable for its female owner. The discovery was made in the tomb of a priest's daughter, which means you didn't have to be male or socially significant in your own right to obtain such advanced medical treatment. The artisan who made this clearly knew a thing or two about human anatomy and physiology. We can tell that not only from the finely crafted toe, but also the belt strap that holds it to the foot. This artifact was made during the Iron Age and was found in a tomb on a graveyard sitting on the hill of Sik Abd Kurna, not far from Luxor and the Valley of the Kings. It's the oldest prosthetic limb ever found, and raises questions about how much more advanced ancient doctors were than we generally give them credit for. There's an episode of the popular BBC science fiction show Doctor Who entitled Vampires of Venice, but few people who've seen that story will have realized that the story might have been rooted in truth. It appears the people who lived in Venice during the 16th century were very afraid of vampires, so much so that they drove stakes through the skulls of anyone they suspected of being one. This gruesome discovery was made on the Venetian island of Lazaretto Nuovo in March 2009. As we can clearly see, a stake-shaped rock has been driven through the open mouth of the poor victim. Matteo Borini of the University of Florence says that this strange practice would have been seen as a way of ensuring that the deceased wouldn't come back from the dead, chew through their shroud, and resume their attacks on the living. It's believed that vampires, despite not existing, took the blame for the 1576 Venetian plague, which left 50,000 people dead in the city that year. A lack of knowledge about epidemiology and decomposition led to people looking for supernatural explanations for the spread of the plague and the grotesque appearance of the corpses in the city's mass graves, and vampires were apparently the most obvious answer. Our next mystery revolves around the fact that one of two hard-to-process facts must be true. Either the legendary Terracotta army of ancient China is an elaborate fake, or the ancient Chinese knew about electrolytic chromium plating long before the rest of the world did. The official story of the Terracotta army is that the clay soldiers are 2,200 years old, and were buried to protect Emperor Qin Shi Huang, China's first emperor, in the afterlife. Western scientists and historians weren't allowed to study any of the clay soldiers in person until 2007, when a team of German experts was allowed access. The analysis of the Germans was that the statues were no more than a few decades old at most. The weapons that the soldiers hold in their hands are covered with chromium plating, of a kind that wasn't invented in Europe until the 1920s. Either someone in China knew how to go about the process over 2,000 years before anyone else in the world did, or the 8,000 clay soldiers that make up the army are nothing more than Chinese propaganda. we wouldn't like to say which one is more likely to be the reality. You might not think there's anything exciting about our next archaeological mystery when you first look at it. To all intents and purposes, it looks like a rusty old bolt, possibly a discarded piece of machinery. Here's the twist. This bolt is 300 million years old. How is that even remotely possible? The bolt was found in the summer of 1998 at a site in Russia by researchers hunting for meteorite fragments near Moscow. It's hard to disagree with the logics of their findings in this case. The rock is 300 million years old, and the bolt is so deeply embedded in the rock that the stone has grown around it. The only conclusion that can be reached is that the bolt is also 300 million years old. That would mean it existed not only before human life on our planet, but before the time of the dinosaurs. Amazingly, this find isn't unique. Examples of screws, bolts, gears, and cogs have been found embedded in equally ancient rocks all over the world. The official scientific explanation is that the shapes are actually crinoid fossils. But surely that can't be possible in every single case. Mummification was the ancient Egyptian way of laying the deceased to eternal rest peacefully and with dignity. So why is it that a few mummies appear to have gone to the grave screaming? The world's best-known screaming mummy is Meritumen, a princess who appears to have spent the past few thousand years crying out in terror long after her death, her mouth wide open and her head tilted back. A CT scan of her remains has suggested she passed away because of a heart attack. That might explain why she appears to be in pain, but embalmers would normally correct this issue when going about the mummification process. Pentawere, the son of Ramses III, is also a notable screaming mummy. Pentawere died of hanging rather than cardiac arrest, so the heart attack theory appears to be out of the window. One possible explanation is that either Meritamun wasn't found until several hours after she passed, by which time rigor mortis had set in and her jaw had locked. Another possibility is that the bandages around her jaw weren't wrapped tightly enough, and so it fell open after she was interred. Neither explanation is entirely satisfactory, though, and so the mystery continues. Grauballe Man is one of the most visited and popular attractions in the Mosgaard Museum in Denmark, and also one of the most grotesque. This 2,300-year-old corpse still has its own skin, hair, and fingernails. That can be chalked up to the fact that he spent almost all of that time buried in a peat bog, which has preserved him almost perfectly. The people who found him by accident while digging peat in 1952 didn't appreciate that near miracle, though. In fact, they took one look at him and ran away in fear. While there are several sets of human remains that have been pulled out of Denmark's numerous peat bogs over the years, Grauballe Man is by far the most famous and the most exceptionally well preserved. In fact, it appears the bog treated him better than his peers did. Physical evidence suggests that he's a human sacrifice victim. His shockingly red hair is believed to be a product of his many years in the bog. It's more likely that he was blonde than red-haired when he was first thrown into it. Would it be fair to call the Antikythera mechanism the world's first computer? Many archaeologists and scientists believe so, but the idea isn't universally accepted because the artifact is difficult to understand. It was found on a 2,000-year-old Greek shipwreck, and is the only object of its type ever discovered. While it's sadly not in the best of shape, it's possible to determine that the artifact contains moving parts, and might even have operated on principles similar to clockwork. One interpretation of the markings on its exterior is that they line up with celestial objects in the night sky, which raises the tantalizing prospect that this is an ancient clockwork navigation device. If that's true, you could consider it an ancient ancestor of GPS, which would definitely qualify it as a computer. A lot of what we think we know about it is based on supposition, though. We found it inside a shipwreck, and so we assume it's a nautical tool. But if it were a common nautical tool, we'd expect to find similar devices on other ancient Greek shipwrecks. Another similar device will have to be found before we can draw any conclusions. There are two schools of thought about the true nature of the Koso artifact. One is that it's nothing more than an amusing geological curiosity that was created a little more than a century ago. The other is that it's evidence of complex tools being used on Earth 500,000 years ago, or perhaps even proof of time travel. We know it's probably easier to believe the first suggestion than the second, but bear with us. there's no doubt about what's at the core of the artifact. It's a spark plug manufactured by a company called Champion at some point during the 1920s. What makes it so baffling is that the iron oxide shell that's formed around it is 500,000 years old, and that age has been proven by laboratory testing. The artifact was found in 1961 in California by researchers out on the hunt for geodes. They didn't find any geodes that day, but this little mystery is arguably more significant than any geode they could ever find. It's physically impossible for the spark plug to have been shoved into the center of the rock after it formed. So how did it get there? Scientists have no idea. In fact, we suspect that they'd rather pretend it didn't exist at all. Considering the fact that they ruled the land that's now known as Scotland for more than 1,200 years, it's alarming how little we know about the Picts. We don't even know how they referred to themselves. We get the term Picts from the ancient writings of the Romans, and it's thought to be a reference to the face paint they wore. The Picts had no written language and left behind very little in the way of buildings or monuments. So every time a trace of their civilization is found, it's always big news in the archaeological world. Here's one. It's a handprint left on a stone anvil by a Pictish metalsmith on the island of Rose, roughly 1,500 years ago. The person who left this behind probably worked with copper, and may even have lived in this cramped building surrounded by 2 anvils and a hearth. Imprints of the smith's knees and hands have also been found at the site. The smith's room is underground and would have been pitch black were it not for the hearth and the red-hot metal he worked with. But the darkness might have been a deliberate choice to help him see and gauge the temperature of metal better. We're returning to China now, where archaeologists found themselves puzzling over the so-called monster art on the wall of this perfectly preserved 1,400-year-old tomb in 2017. Things depicted on the murals include a naked humanoid, a horse with wings, and a strange monster that appears to be made of blue fire. The tomb is nothing like any other burial place of its era ever found, so there's no reference guide to refer to. The paintings and carvings elsewhere in the tomb are of villagers riding horses or working within their communities, so it's just this one wall that seems so out of place. The most educated experts from the Shanxi Provincial Institute of Archaeology were summoned to inspect the wall art, but they were left just as confused as everybody else. If we could decipher the images correctly, they might tell us who was buried in the tomb, but as we can't, we might never know. The images aren't necessarily a reference to the tomb's occupant, though. They could just as easily be a reference to an ancient Chinese mystical concept that we're unable to comprehend. The history of ancient humans sailing and seafaring isn't anything like as well understood as we'd like it to be. We don't really know who the first people to make boats are, or how far they might have sailed. We do, however, know that the Vikings made it as far as North America, and so almost anything is possible. Does that mean that Piri Reis made it to Antarctica? Perhaps so. The Piri Reis map, named after the Turkish admiral who either commissioned or drew it in 1513, contains far more detail than a person of that era should have known about. That includes the coastline of Antarctica, a continent that wasn't officially discovered for another 300 years. The representation of the coastline is too accurate for his drawing to be guesswork, so he must have seen it, even if he did so from afar. Oddly, he's drawn it without ice, so either Antarctica looked very different back then, or he was working from another reference map and mistranslated some details. Whatever the reason, it appears that the Turkish Navy had at least some knowledge of Antarctica long before other nations began laying claims to discovering it during the 19th century. And we have no idea how that could be possible using the wooden ships of the time. Archaeology is the study of human history, but you don't have to travel very far back in human history to find great archaeological discoveries. In fact, incredible artifacts and objects are found almost every week of the year. There's always something new and interesting to report in this exciting field of the sciences, and we're always excited to bring the biggest and best new discoveries to you on this channel. That's what we're doing in this video. A whole host of fascinating discoveries have been made recently on the Greek island of Santorini at a site known as Archaeological. In early 2019, archaeologists excavated what they believed to be an ancient public building known as the House of Benches. The site has already been partially explored in the past, leading to the discovery of the golden ibex that you'll now find on display in the Museum of Prehistoric Thera. The more recent discoveries include a marble figurine of a proto-Cycladic female, along with a series of collared jars, a marble vial, and a vase made from alabaster. Experts are currently working on the idea that the area might have been a focal point for ritual acts in ancient times, an idea backed by the numerous rich murals that decorate the building's southern wall. As more studies are carried out in the area, archaeologists and historians hope to gain a greater understanding of the culture, and possibly also the religious beliefs of the prehistoric Aegean society that once lived here and established the first Theran society. These days, when Americans think of turkeys, they probably also think of Thanksgiving. But turkeys represented far more than food to the Native Americans who lived in the old American Southwest. Blanket making was a sacred art to many Native American tribes, but never before had we seen such extensive use of turkey feathers in blanket making before the discovery of this incredible feather blanket in November 2020. The people who made this artifact, which contains more than 11,000 feathers, were the ancestors of the Pueblo Indians, who still live in this area today. The blanket, which was found in Utah, is around 800 years old and was made by wrapping feathers around yucca fiber cord. The feathers of around 10 turkeys would have been required to complete the work. The find is especially important because so few textiles like this have survived the passing of the centuries, and so until now, it's been difficult to gain an insight into how they were made. Inventing thermal garments like this would have been necessary for the expansion of ancient Native Americans into very cold areas. In many cases, they lived at elevations of over 5,000 feet above sea level, where surviving the winter would have been impossible without these blankets. The famous site of Pompeii in Italy, buried by a volcano and frozen in time almost 2,000 years ago, was first discovered almost 250 years ago. Excavation work at the site is still ongoing today, and new discoveries are made all the time. The most remarkable recent find at the site is 2 men who appear to have perished together when the volcano struck the town. And if experts are to be believed, they were an aristocrat and his slave. The room they were in was totally destroyed when their house collapsed in on them, but their remains were preserved by the pyroclastic currents that flowed beneath the wreckage. It's thought that they were victims of the second such flow that struck the area, meaning they were fortunate enough to survive the initial eruption, but didn't have the good sense to flee the area before the second wave of destruction arrived. The older of the 2 victims was in his 40s at the time of the disaster, while the other is either in his late teens or early 20s and has damaged vertebra, a sign that he carried out heavy manual labor during his lifetime, from which the theory that he was a slave has been formulated. Upon first inspection, you'd assume that this skeleton, which was found in the desert of Wadi al-Hitan in Egypt, was a dinosaur. That's understandable, but it's also incorrect. You're actually looking at the remains of a Basilosaurus, which is a prehistoric ancestor of the modern whale. A desert is a strange place to find the remains of a whale, and what makes it even stranger is the fact that it technically didn't have to be discovered or excavated at all. The remains have slowly pushed their way up through the sand of the desert over millions of years, until they eventually became fully visible 3 years ago. To add to the uniqueness of this incredible discovery, it's the only complete Basilosaurus skeleton ever found on Earth, and so it allows experts to reach new conclusions about the ancient creature. Prior to this discovery, they had no idea that they could grow up to 50 feet long. Back when the creature was alive, this part of the world was once part of an ocean. Plenty of fossilized ancient marine life has been found in the area, and more will probably be found in the future. While archaeologists do all that they can to find ancient burial grounds, temples, buildings, and other sites of interest, it's sometimes easier for people working in other professions to make those discoveries. Roadworks often turn up unexpected results, for example, and the veracity of that statement was shown again when an ancient Islamic burial ground was uncovered during the construction of a road in Zaragoza, Spain in November 2020. The burial site, which is believed to be the oldest of its kind in northern Spain, is enormous. The remains of over 4,500 people are buried there, and have probably been there since the Muslim conquest of the Iberian Peninsula during the 8th century. Only 400 of the graves have been excavated so far, so the experts clearly have a lot of work to do in order to extract all the information they can from the site before it becomes necessary to resume the road-building project. Scientists intend to perform DNA analysis on the remains in an attempt to find out more about where these people came from, and in the process, hopefully discover more about how Islam spread across Spain following the conquest. Paleontologists and historians had a whale of a time in Thailand in November 2020 when they came across the perfectly preserved skeleton of a 40-foot-long whale close to the coast of Samut Sakhon, where it's been waiting to be discovered for over 5,000 years. Initial studies of the remains of the whale have confirmed that it's a bride's whale, a species of the colossal creatures that still exist today. The fossilized skeleton was found around 7.5 miles from the coastline, demonstrating that the sea once encroached further into this land than it does today. That's probably down to tectonic activity in the region over the past few thousand years, which is thought to have raised it 13 feet above sea level since the whale perished. Because the creature belongs to a species that's still alive today, these remains offer scientists an opportunity to compare and contrast modern bride's whales with their ancient ancestors, trying to find differences in the way they live today to the way they behaved thousands of years ago. In the process, those studies might shed new light on the geological and paleontological conditions of the area during ancient times. When a team of Turkish fishers cast their nets in the waters of Marmaris in November 2020, they immediately knew that whatever they'd caught in those nets wasn't fish. It was far too heavy. Hauling their equipment back onto their boat, they were astonished to see that they'd snared an enormous headless statue. They immediately informed the Coast Guard, who in turn contacted experts from the Marmaris Museum to come and take a closer look. They confirmed that the massive statue, which weighs close to 900 pounds, is made from solid bronze and appears to be a perfect copy of the famous Lady of Kalymnos sculpture that stands in the Archaeological Museum of Kalymnos in Greece. If we assume that it was made at the same time as the original Hellenistic sculpture, it's at least 2,200 years old. Coincidentally, the first Lady of Kalymnos statue was also found by accident in the sea in 1994. It now appears that both statues were thrown into the water deliberately. Frustratingly, we might never find out why that happened, or why the second statue has had its head removed. When the discovery of a 17,000-year-old Venus statue was announced in Romania in June 2020, it initially prompted a wave of excitement among archaeologists and historians. That excitement has since turned into suspicion. Because the discovery was made by amateur archaeologists rather than professionals in Piatra Neamt in the country's northeast, it's been accused of being a forgery. Right now, it's on display at the Museum of Human Evolution and Technology, but that might change if the allegations of fraud can be proven. On the other hand, if it can be proven to be a genuine artifact, it will be confirmed as the first ever Venus-style sculpture ever found in Romania. The archaeologists who claim to have made the discovery point to the fact that the age of the sculpture has been verified via radiocarbon dating, but skeptics point out that the sculpture was apparently found, removed from the site, and then put back the next day so that photographs of the moment it was discovered could be staged. They insist that moving the statue has compromised its archaeological provenance, and so it shouldn't be trusted. It looks pretty real to us. What do you think? Here's another one statue from the ancient city of Laodicea in Denizli, Turkey. There's no controversy or doubt about the age of this one or who it's supposed to represent. It's a sculpture of the great Roman Emperor Trajan, and it was made in the year 113. In terms of its size and intricate details, it's one of the most remarkable examples of sculpture of its era. It's also been no less of a remarkable achievement to put it all back together. When the 10-foot-tall statue was found, it was in more than 350 pieces. It shows the emperor in a typically powerful pose, with an enemy soldier cowering behind him with his hands bound. Trajan is credited with expanding the Roman Empire more than any leader who came before him, and also enriching its people at the same time. Given the detailed nature of the statue's face, it's likely that whoever created it had seen the emperor with his own eyes. Interestingly, the statue features 2 griffins on the emperor's chest, which are generally seen as representations of Apollo. Apollo was the god of the fine arts, and so it could be that Trajan was either a supporter of the arts or had a strong personal interest in them. We're all familiar with the concept of holy water. Humans have believed that water can cleanse the spirit as well as the body for thousands of years, and also in some cases, heal the sick. Here's an example of that belief in action at a site in Bulgaria. It's a 1,500-year-old holy well full of allegedly healing water, and it would have been a focal point for the religious people of the region centuries ago. The well has been found on the grounds of an ancient Christian monastery on St. Ivan's Island, buried under over 15 feet of rubble and detritus. The island was once a sacred place to the Thracians during the 7th century and went on to play host to an enormous monastery that eventually became an imperial monastery during the 14th century. It was demolished by the Ottoman Turks in 1629, causing the well to be obscured and then forgotten about until its rediscovery in November 2020. The well, which is full of fresh water even after so many years of burial, appears to predate the arrival of the Thracians, and so the identity of whoever built it is unknown. They say that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, so we'll leave you to decide whether this next alleged discovery meets that description. Here, we see a very old house underneath the Sisters of Nazareth convent in Israel. For the past 14 years, Professor Ken Dark of Reading University, England, has been studying the house, and he now feels confident in saying that this is the childhood home of Jesus Christ. The structure, which can be dated to the 1st century, isn't far from the Church of the Annunciation, the place where Christian beliefs say that Mary was informed that she would bear the Son of God. The house is fairly typical of its era, which is consistent with the idea that Jesus' family were neither especially rich nor especially poor. Ken Dark says that the construction of the walls is consistent with someone who knew a thing or two about stonework. Joseph, as a craftsman, would match that description. There's also the fact that someone saw fit to build a Byzantine church on top of the house during the 5th century, so the site must have been considered significant back then. The church was known as the Church of the Nutrition, which has been taken as a reference to Christ's upbringing. None of this is concrete proof, but it surely has to be classed as a possibility. We're heading back to Bulgaria now to take a look at this fascinating ancient clay mask, found at the site of Provadia Solnițata in November 2020. Alien conspiracy theories have been quick to point out that the mask has no mouth, a tiny nose, and huge almond-shaped eyes, making it appear similar to the kind of alien that's normally described in alien abduction stories. Might it have a more earthly explanation, though? This ancient settlement is one of Europe's oldest, and used to be at the heart of the European salt trade during the Chalcolithic era. Almost every hobby, substance, and industry had its own dedicated deity thousands of years ago, and salt mining was no different. According to ancient Roman traditions, the goddess of the sea and salt water was Salacia, and this mask is more likely to be a depiction of her than it is to be a depiction of aliens. While it might not be the smoking gun evidence of alien visitation that some people believe it to be, it's still a fascinating and unique piece of ancient art. It tells us how much the people of the time thought it was the gods, rather than the vast quantity of naturally occurring salt that they had at their disposal that were responsible for their prosperity. In a sense, archaeology is about taking what's old and making it new again. Archaeologists take things that have been buried for centuries or perhaps even thousands of years, and then provide us with new information about these ancient items. If that's true, then the most recent discoveries in the field of archaeology have to be counted as the newest of the ancient new, and we've got the best of them in this video. For almost as long as modern humans have existed, they've decorated their bodies with jewelry. We can see that reflected in this ivory pendant, which was recently discovered in Paleolithic archaeological layers inside Stajnia Cave in Poland. Archaeologists say that, incredibly, the pendant is 41,500 years old. That makes it the oldest jewelry ever found in Eurasia, a full 1,500 years older than when we previously thought that Europe's first Homo sapiens started creating pendants. What inspired these early humans to begin making and wearing jewelry is unknown, but it's highly likely that the perforated pendant was fitted with string and worn around the neck. Aside from the holes, the artifact also has 50 puncture marks in the shape of a curve. The dots are likely to signify something. Experts have speculated that it might be a calendar, but there's currently no way to be sure. Alternative theories include the idea that it might be a head count of successfully hunted animals, or just simply a decorative pattern that the pendant's owner found pleasing. Over in England, an incredibly rare mosaic was discovered in Rutland in November 2020. The mosaic is unique because of the scene it depicts, which is a battle between Hector and Achilles at the conclusion of the Trojan War. Mosaics featuring this motif have been found before, but only on continental Europe. This is the first mosaic of its kind ever to be found in the British Isles. The mosaic was discovered by accident, by a man out for a walk in a wheat field. He first noticed a few fragments of Roman pottery, but when archaeologists came to the site and used satellite imagery to help them in their search, the presence of the mosaic was detected. The enormous mosaic, measuring 36 feet by 23 feet, was probably once the floor of a large dining room in a Roman villa. Based on analysis of the pottery fragments, the villa probably existed between the 3rd and 4th centuries. There are signs of former outbuildings in the area around the footprint of the villa, so it's possible that more discoveries will be made here in the near future. Let's go back to the topic of jewelry for a moment, because at the end of November 2021, archaeologists in Morocco announced the discovery of the oldest jewelry in the world. Their find is a set of 33 perforated sea snail shells, which were found in the Bisman Cave not far from the country's southern Atlantic coast. The assessment of the experts at the scene is that the shell beads are somewhere between 142,000 and 150,000 years old. Inside some of the shells are traces of red ochre, which suggests that some or all of them were painted before being worn. Red ochre was significant to many ancient humans, who used it to paint everything from the walls of caves to the bones of their ancestors. The reasons for this aren't known. The archaeologist in charge of the team says that the beads should be interpreted as a method of communication from a time when humans had no written language and might only barely have had a spoken one, but the meaning of creating and wearing them might never be known. Again, it's possible that the archaeologists are trying to read too much into it. Masks were essential cultural items to many of the ancient races of Africa, but there are no African masks stranger than the Griebo masks, created and worn by the Griebo and Kru people of Cape Palmas in West Africa's coastal region. They're shaped roughly like a human face, but are thought to have been worn like helmets on the top of the head. The multiple protruding holes in their surfaces have been interpreted by some historians as representations of eyes, but that's far from conclusive. Many of the masks were found in the ruins of an ancient village in a mountainous part of the region in the 1950s. Their function is uncertain. They might have been used to terrify enemies on the battlefield, or they might have had a less warlike ceremonial use. It's tough to say how old the masks are because the very origins of the Kru and Griebo people are still unknown. Multiple examples of the masks have been found over the years, so it's likely that they were available to everybody, rather than reserved for the use of the ruling elite, but that doesn't get us any closer to knowing why they exist at all. When we think about the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in the year 79, we think about the destruction of Pompeii. Pompeii and its citizens weren't the only victims of the volcano, though. It also destroyed Herculaneum. Like Pompeii, Herculaneum is still an active archaeological site, and in December 2021, archaeologists found the remains of a man who might have been the volcano's final victim. He was just a few steps from the sea on the city's beach when the eruption caught up with him, carrying a bag that probably contained all of his valuables. That suggests that he was, understandably, trying to run away from the disaster. There's a wooden box inside the leather bag, and inside the box, archaeologists have been able to identify a metal ring. Archaeologists are hoping to extract the bag and take it back to a laboratory, but it's close to the man's spine and might prove to be too difficult to retrieve without damaging the petrified skeleton. Much of Herculaneum is still buried beneath 100 feet of volcanic rock, with the modern city of Ercolano right on top of it. So the work of archaeologists is challenging and is likely to continue for more than a century. When the remains of England's King Richard III were found underneath a supermarket car park in 2012, it seemed like an unlikely place to find a burial of some importance. We're now starting to think we should look underneath more supermarkets for ancient graves, because a whole Roman necropolis was found underneath a supermarket in Arras, France in late November 2021. The first sign of the existence of the necropolis was a large 4th century lead sarcophagus, which was found during survey work prior to the construction of a planned extension for the supermarket. A full excavation of the site has revealed that the burial ground stretches all the way underneath the supermarket's existing buildings and then on into the next property. The burials appear to be little more than basic graves, with almost no grave goods buried with any of the bodies. The only exception was a single grave containing an adult woman who was buried with her earrings, copper bangles, copper finger rings, and a pearl necklace. All of these people would have been citizens of the Roman Empire, living during a time when Arras was called Atrebatum and ruled from Rome. Aside from being an interesting find in its own right, our next discovery is being presented by archaeologists as evidence that technology transfer went on during times of antiquity. The find is a 2,700-year-old set of leather armor that was found inside the tomb of a horse rider in Turfan, northwest China in December 2021. The design of the armor is more Neo-Assyrian than Chinese, so it was probably an import. In that way, it represents the transfer of what would then have been considered new technology from west to east, during a time long before historians previously thought that such a thing went on. Armor like this was a popular choice because it offered protection for vital organs without restricting movement. It would also have been very expensive and considered very valuable, so it would normally have been passed on after the death of an owner, rather than buried with them. Burying the armor with this particular individual would, therefore, likely be a mark of enormous respect. It might have been a symbolic way of saying that nobody else was worthy of wearing their armor. The expensive restoration of Calvary Old Hall in Leeds, Yorkshire, England, in late 2021 came with an unexpected bonus when restoration workers found a complete, grotesque-style 16th century Tudor wall painting hiding behind a 19th century plaster wall in one of the manor home's bedrooms. In keeping with the grotesque style, which was enormously popular in Europe at the time, the painting is all black, with details including mythical creatures and men climbing vines picked out in white. The painting was probably created during the 1540s. It was likely commissioned by Sir William Calvary, a knight of the realm and former Sheriff of York. It's thought that rather than being an attempt to cover up the work, the addition of the 19th century plaster wall was an attempt to protect it. The property was abandoned and became derelict not long after that, remaining that way until it was acquired by the Landmark Trust during the 1980s. By that time, the fact the painting existed at all had been forgotten. The plaster wall now won't be replaced, and the painting will be carefully restored and protected as part of the wider ongoing restoration project. When you hear the words woven fabric, you'll probably think of wool or linen. You almost certainly wouldn't think of oak, and yet oak was the material used in the world's oldest preserved woven fabric. The unusual textiles were found at Archaeological, a Neolithic settlement in Turkey. They're somewhere between 8,500 and 8,700 years old, and are made from bast fiber harvested from the region's oak trees. Perhaps we shouldn't be surprised at finding something so odd in Archaeological. It's a strange place, with 18 archaeological layers piled on top of each other and a history that goes back 9,000 years, but no sign of any large public buildings in any of those layers. Archaeologists have known bast fibers to have been used to make rope, yarn, and cloth before, and already knew that the practice went back thousands of years, but they had no idea that it went back quite this far, or that it appears to predate the use of what we now see as more traditional weaving materials. It seems that the ancient people of Archaeological were basically dressed in trees. We've already looked at a surprising mosaic discovery in this video, but why stop at one when you can have two? These stunning Gallo-Roman mosaic floors were found beneath a chateau stable during an archaeological survey at Château de Marigny in Fleurville, France. The floors are part of a much wider Roman discovery which includes service rooms, corridors, an antechamber, and a hypocaust. The mosaic floors, of which there are two, are thought to have been the floors of two large reception rooms in what would have been a very luxurious Roman villa. Based on the style of the mosaics, they're likely to have been created towards the end of the 1st century. It must have been gone long before the chateau was built during the 16th century. The farmhouse and stables that cover the largest of the mosaic floors were added to the site in the 19th century, and it seems unlikely that they could have been built without the patterned floor being noticed. But if the workers did notice, it seems that they decided to keep it quiet. What Paul Fitzsimmons, a very experienced antique dealer, did with this next artifact seems almost unfair. He bought an oak carving of a bird at an auction for £75, in the full knowledge that it was almost certainly worth far more. He was correct in his assessment that the artifact once belonged to British royalty. To be more specific, it belonged to Anne Boleyn, the first of King Henry VIII's wives to be beheaded. The king ordered all of her property to be destroyed at the same time he ordered her execution. But this carving, which is thought to be of a falcon, was probably rescued by one of her maids or supporters and taken as a keepsake. It can be identified as Anne Boleyn's because her heraldic emblem is carved into the sculpture. Somehow the auction house missed that and listed it only as an antique carved wooden bird. Their loss could be Paul's gain, as he believes he'd now be able to sell it for a price closer to £200,000. Instead of doing that, he's decided to donate it to Hampton Court Palace, where Anne Boleyn once lived. Preparations for a new high-speed railway are currently underway in the United Kingdom, and the new track will run straight through several areas of archaeological interest, destroying them in the process. That means archaeologists have one last chance to search these areas before they're lost for good. One such site is that of a Norman-era church in Stoke Mandeville, Buckinghamshire, called St. Mary's. Archaeologists have been there since the start of November 2021, and would have left already, but on the last day of their planned dig, they found a trio of Roman-era statues, broken and buried in the ground. The archaeologists were hoping to find artifacts from around the time of the church's creation in the year 1080, so finding these 1800-year-old artifacts instead was a huge surprise. All three of the statues were deliberately decapitated. The bodies of the adult statues were buried right next to the heads, but the torso of the child hasn't yet been found. It's possible that the statues were destroyed when the church was built on the grounds that they were considered sacrilegious, but it's equally possible that they were destroyed as a symbolic act after the Romans left Britain. Archaeologists find many relics of the past in the course of their job, but they only understand some of them. When they come across a puzzle they can't solve, they'll turn to historians and scientists for help. Even then, though, there are still some finds that defy all attempts to explain them. We've got some truly mystifying finds for you in this video. In many cases, they're still not fully understood, even after years of research. If we told you that an amazing discovery had been made beneath some sand dunes, you'd probably assume we're talking about Egypt. In this case, though, we're talking about Spain. In May 2021, these stunning Roman baths were found under the sand dunes of Trafalgar Cape in southern Spain. The discovery was made during an archaeological survey of the area. The remaining walls of these ancient structures, which were built about 2,000 years ago, stand 20 feet tall. It seems amazing that nobody knew they were there for all these years, but the dune that concealed them was closer to 30 feet high. Many of the local residents have fond memories of running up and down the dunes as children, blissfully unaware they were literally trampling all over history. The sand has done a good job of protecting the baths. The windows, walls, and doors are still visible in many places, as is the clever central heating system that distributed heat throughout the buildings through gaps beneath the floor and between the walls. There was a fish farm and a salting center here during Roman times, so the baths were probably built as a facility for the workers. Our next discovery comes from Ukraine, where a very unusual kurgan was found in early 2021. The kurgan, which is another name for burial mound, was well buried and took several months to fully excavate. This was actually an accidental discovery. It was found by construction workers laying a new road into the nearby village of Novoaleksandrivka. What makes the mound so unusual is its sheer size. It's 400 feet wide and 250 feet long, with a height of 20 feet. Not only that, but it appears that people came here to bury their dead for hundreds of years. 24 burials have been found within the kurgan thus far, starting in the Bronze Age and continuing throughout the Scythian Age and the Middle Ages. Based on fragments of ceramics that appear to be left over from the construction of the mound, it was probably made around 5,500 years ago. An enormous number of ground-up shells have also been found in the lower layers of the mound. Their purpose is unknown. Restoration work will be performed on the mound after the last of the excavation work is finished, and then a museum will be opened at the site. Speaking of burial sites that were used for hundreds of years, here's a puzzling collection of rock-cut tombs carved into the cliffs of Al-Himidiya in Sohag, Egypt. There are just over 250 tombs at the site, the first of which was carved about 4,200 years ago, and the last of which was cut about 2,000 years after that. The nature of the burials that took place here seems to have changed dramatically over time. During the first 8 or 9 centuries of the site's use, the people laid to rest here were very rich, very powerful, or both. They were given large chambers with decorated walls and ceilings, often with cross halls to go with them. By the end, the archaeological evidence suggests that the site was used to bury commoners. Their tombs are much more modest, consisting of little other than a small niche carved into the rock. We don't know for what reason, if any, the nature of the burials changed, nor do we know why the ancient Egyptians spontaneously decided to stop burying people here after using the site for such a long time. In June 2020, Israeli archaeologists from the Hebrew University made a unique discovery while excavating the ancient city of Lachish in the Judean plain. There, they found an ornate bronze scepter topped with a layer of silver. According to their research, the artifact is around 3,200 years old and might be connected with an ancient Canaanite god. They think their discovery was once part of a statue of a Canaanite deity that would have stood in the corner of a temple. Such statues are discussed in the Bible and are always described as holding a scepter. For that reason, the find has been nicknamed the Scepter of God. In truth, it looks more like a spatula than a scepter. It's only the presence of symbols engraved on the object that marks it out as something other than a tool. The meaning of the symbols is sadly unknown. It might be that they have no meaning at all beyond decoration, but the arrangement of the patterns seems specific and deliberate. There's much that we don't know about this ancient culture, but finds like this move us one step further along the road to knowing them better. This next find is one of the most bizarre we've ever discussed on our channel. In 1979, this shrunken head prop was used in a movie called Wise Blood. Sometime after the film was made, the prop ended up in the hands of Mercer University in Georgia, USA. That's when a disturbing discovery was made. While the object might have been used as a prop, there's nothing fake about it. This is a genuine shrunken human head. After the researchers there got over the shock, they managed to unpick the head's true history. It's now thought that biologist Jim Harrison acquired the head, known as a Santa, while visiting Ecuador in 1942. It was Harrison who loaned it to the film production crew in 1979, but he neglected to tell them it was real. Hundreds of fake Santas were made to satisfy macabre Western tastes in the 1950s and 1960s, so the film crew had no reason to believe this one was real. Once the truth became known, Mercer University decided the best thing to do was to send the Santa back home to Ecuador, which they did via the Ecuadorian consulate. That was probably the strangest request they had to deal with all year. The Romans gave the world many fantastic inventions, but perhaps none were better than the aqueduct. And perhaps no Roman aqueduct is greater than the Aqueduct of Constantinople. Building this enormous structure would have taken hundreds of people decades to achieve, and maintaining it might have even been harder. When a study group from the Johannes Gutenberg University Mainz studied the aqueduct in early 2021, they got an insight into just how hard that process would have been. To their surprise, they found that the entire structure was scraped clean of carbonate deposits at least once per decade for the entire 7 centuries that the aqueduct remained active. Considering the fact it runs on for more than 70 miles, that's a gargantuan task. It's even more impressive when you consider the size of the masonry channels, which in places are large enough for human beings to walk through without having to duck. Because of the diligent work of the Romans, the aqueduct was still in perfect working order time of the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines took over where the Romans had left off, presumably using the same mysterious cleaning methods to keep the water flowing. What do you think the oldest stone monuments in the world are? Stonehenge in England? Wrong. The pyramids of Egypt? Not even close. The correct answer is the mustatils of Saudi Arabia. Thanks to a relatively recent study of these strange monuments, we now know that they were created around 7,000 years ago. Regrettably, we still don't know their purpose. Although the size of the mustatils varies, they're all the same rectangular shape, with raised platforms at each end. Archaeologists have found animal skulls and horns in the center of some of the monuments, which might mean that ritual or sacrificial activity took place within them. Alternatively, it might mean that they were animal enclosures. If so, they would be the oldest known examples of humans keeping animals. There are well over 1,000 mustatils in Saudi Arabia, scattered over an area of more than 300 square miles. The fact that Neolithic-era people undertook such an enormous construction task flies in the face of almost everything we think we know about them. Everything about the mustatils leaves us with more questions than answers. For several hundred years, a bronze cannon from the Spanish Armada laid undisturbed at the bottom of the sea close to Ribera, Spain. Within days of its discovery, it went missing and was eventually recovered by the police. The cannon is one of 3 that were found by Spanish fishermen in April 2021. They reported their find to the appropriate regional authorities, but when the Navy arrived at the scene to recover the 16th century artifacts, they found just 2. Clearly, one of the fishermen had returned since their discovery to take one home as a souvenir. The guilty party was arrested for committing a cultural heritage offense, along with 3 members of their family. Archaeologists think the cannons came from a ship sent by Spanish King Philip II to battle English forces in October 1596, long after the defeat of the original Spanish Armada. The ship never made it to the battle. It sank during a storm as one of 20 lost close to Cape Finisterre. Now the 3 cannons have been reunited. They're in the hands of the Galician Sea Museum in Vigo for restoration and, eventually, public display. Hundreds of mummified bodies have been found in Egypt over the years. Many of them are in museums or private collections. Of all the mummies that have ever been found, none is like the one we see here. When it was discovered in 1826, it was thought to be the remains of a male priest. We don't blame the archaeologists of the time for coming to that conclusion. The name of the priest was inscribed on the sarcophagus the mummy was found with. At the start of 2021, a team of experts in Poland decided to perform a new study on the mummy. To their immense surprise, they found it wasn't a male priest. In fact, it wasn't even a male. These are the mummified remains of a pregnant woman. This is the first and only discovery of a pregnant mummy in history. While all of the usual mummification processes have been carried out on the rest of her body, her womb and the baby inside it, it hasn't been possible to determine why she died. Were left untouched. She would have been in her mid-20s when she passed away and was probably only 2 months away from giving birth. For all their technological achievements, the Romans never got around to inventing clockwork. If they wanted to work out the time, they used a sundial. If they wanted to check the time while on the move, they probably used tiny pocket sundials like this one. The surprisingly elaborate artifact was found during an excavation of Piazza dei Moraccioli in Pisa, Italy during the 1980s. Due to a clerical error, it ended up being mislabeled and put into the wrong box, effectively resulting in it being forgotten on a shelf in a university for more than 30 years. It wasn't until a curious student opened the box in April 2021 that it saw the light of day again. What amazed both the student and the other experts who've since examined it is the intricacy of its design. The time grid that was etched into its ivory surface 2,200 years ago is delicate and detailed, still capable of telling the time today. Only one other ivory sundial has ever been found, and that one came from Egypt. The cost of the exceptional craftsmanship that went into the creation of this timepiece was probably quite high, so we can assume that the sundial belonged to someone important. There's been a flurry of archaeological discoveries in Egypt recently, but this one is surely the most impressive. In April 2021, archaeologists in the country confirmed the incredible discovery of an entire city. Such is the size of the previously unknown settlement that archaeologists expect to spend the next 10 years excavating it. The city, which has provisionally been named the Rise of Aten, has spent the past 3,000 years buried under the sand of the Egyptian desert east of Luxor. Excitingly, this appears to be the largest ancient settlement ever discovered in the country. Its size suggests great importance, which might mean the presence of several buried ancient kings and queens. Very little is known about the city so far, but the current working theory is that it was founded by Amenhotep III around 3,400 years ago and lasted throughout the time of Tutankhamun and I. So far, archaeologists have been working through buildings used to store meat and produce bricks. They hope to start excavating temples by September 2021. Some of the homes in and around the brick factories are so well preserved that they still have everyday household objects in them. So the temples might prove to be the richest ever found in Egypt. If you wanted to draw up a legal document in the 12th century, you'd have to go and find a scrap of sheepskin to write it on. That probably sounds bizarre to you, but the practice of writing contracts on sheepskin was still happening as recently as the start of the 20th century. The reason for this was a simple but effective one. Sheepskin contains several layers of fat, and obvious marks on its surface are made if the fat is scratched away. If someone tried to change or remove details from a document written on sheepskin parchment, their attempt to do so would be easy to see. Sheepskin was, therefore, used for the prevention of fraud. It might even be the case that the practice goes back further than the 12th century. We know it was in use by then because it's referred to by the writings of former Lord Treasurer of England Richard Fitz-Neal, who mentions it in his extremely dry manuscript Dialogus de Sicario. But there's nothing to say that it wasn't an already well-established practice by Fitz-Neal's time. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and enjoy watching new videos on my channel. Thanks for watching, and see you soon!